twin moons of Galaris Sigma hovered in perpetual dusk, casting long indigo shadows across the crystalline towers of the Galactic Academy. The floating campus was held aloft by anti-gravity columns etched with pulsating runes, technology left behind by the original founders, whose genius still loomed over every corridor. For over a century, the Academy had stood as the pinnacle of interstellar education, where the most brilliant minds of every known species competed to solve the galaxy's hardest problems. But no enigma captured the imagination of scholars like the Sigma sequence, the code embedded in the Academy's gate of intellect, the massive obsidian archway that every student passed beneath upon admission. At first glance, it was merely decorative, a swirling band of numbers etched into the surface, subtly glowing in hues that changed depending on the planetary alignment. But it was much more. The founders of the Academy had devised it as both a test and a gift. The gate was encoded with a sequence so complex that deciphering it was believed to grant access to a near-limitless energy source buried deep beneath the planet's crust. Alien mathematicians, quantum theorists, neural symbiotes, and even collective consciousnesses had tried and failed to solve it. It had become a rite of passage, studying it, attempting to make sense of it, and inevitably surrendering to its elusive patterns. Some claimed it was unsolvable, others believed it required a species not yet known to the galaxy, and so it stood, humming gently, daring anyone to unlock its secrets. When the Council announced that, for the first time in Academy history, a human cadet would join the ranks, the reaction was mixed. Some professors expressed curiosity, others disapproval. The more conservative alien scholars saw humanity as a recently discovered anomaly, barely past its nuclear adolescence and still grappling with internal divisions. To allow one of them into the hallowed halls of the Academy felt, to many, like a gesture of political appeasement rather than merit-based inclusion. But the human in question, Nina Alvarez, had scored perfectly on the galactic entry aptitude trials and submitted an independent analysis of harmonic frequency collapses in asteroid drift fields that caught the attention of the Astrometrics Guild. She was not a token. She was, by all definitions, exceptional. When Nina arrived, the transport vessel drifted silently toward the landing platform as thousands of students, some with glowing eyes, some with translucent wings, others without visible features at all, turned to see the newcomer. She stepped out wearing a regulation gray uniform tailored for her frame, her dark hair neatly tied back. She didn't wave or smile, only adjusted the strap of the old satchel slung over her shoulder and began walking forward. The gate loomed before her, its numbers shimmering faintly as if sensing something new. A few onlookers whispered, exchanging binary codes or electromagnetic pulses. One reptilian student smirked and said aloud, "It breathes air and thinks it can solve the gate?" Nina didn't respond. She stopped in front of the gate and looked up. The numbers spiraled in and out of each other, like digits caught in a cosmic whirlpool. She had seen them before, of course, studied them endlessly in her preparatory years. But standing beneath them now, with the weight of the Academy pressing in from all sides, the numbers felt heavier, alive even. A soft chime sounded, signaling her formal entry, and the gate's energy shifted slightly, a flicker so faint only a few noticed. The gate had acknowledged her. The days that followed were dense with lectures on theoretical dimensional modeling, gravitational waveform transposition, and alien numeral cognition. Nina kept to herself, taking notes with precision and rarely speaking unless addressed. She sat in the back of most lecture halls, absorbing, calculating, thinking. The professors, most of whom were thousands of years older than her, watched with veiled skepticism. She didn't exhibit the quantum instinct of the Drell, nor the bioluminescent memory recall of the Zelen species. She wrote everything by hand, on paper, using a system no one else recognized. Some thought it quaint, others found it irritating. Her primary coursework included a mandatory session on the Sigma sequence. The class was taught by Professor Geonix, an ancient cephalarian whose mind operated on 12 cognitive layers simultaneously. He greeted the class with a monotone pulse and immediately activated a holographic projection of the gate's full numerical layout. "This," he said, is not a problem you will solve. It is a question that defines you. Nina stared at the projection. The numbers swirled again, slowly rotating, shifting, flickering through thousands of symbols per second. To most, it was beautiful, but incomprehensible. To Nina, it was irritating. Something about it nagged at her brain, not because it was complex, but because it didn't seem finished. It felt like a pattern interrupted, as if someone had started humming a song and then stopped mid-note. After class, while others debated theoretical approaches, fractal inversion, multidimensional substitution, recursive CAL algorithms, Nina wandered the campus. She preferred quiet places, the gardens on the lower level, where the gravity was lighter and the sound of wind came from hidden speakers. She often sat beneath a tree engineered to survive the vacuum of space, sketching numbers in the air with her finger, letting the pattern repeat in her mind. She wasn't trying to solve it, at least not yet. She was trying to hear it. One evening, just before the third lunar tide, she sat in her dorm, staring at the projection of the sequence. She had drawn it on the wall using a reflective pen, one that refracted light into colored layers. The numbers blinked at her. Her mind wandered. She thought of Earth, of her grandmother's voice, and of a silly rhyme she had loved as a child. Una elefanta se balanzaba sobre la tela de una arana. It was a game she used to play, adding an elephant with each verse, imagining the spider's web growing stronger or weaker depending on the mood. She whispered it to herself, laughing quietly at the memory. Then she stopped. She looked at the numbers again. Something flickered in her memory. The cadence of the rhyme, the slow addition, the recursive nature, the way it circled back on itself, mirrored the progression of certain digits in the outer ring of the sequence. It couldn't be. She stood up, approached the wall, and began reciting the rhyme aloud, this time tapping each syllable to a number. Her voice echoed faintly, the air seeming to hold its breath. The numbers aligned, not perfectly, but close enough to make her pulse quicken. She stayed up all night after that, repeating the rhyme, adjusting the sequence, overlaying the rhythm onto the pattern. She wasn't imagining it. The sequence wasn't random. It was musical. It followed a recursive rhythmic structure similar to that of a children's counting rhyme. Not in language, not in theme, but in form. Whoever had created it hadn't just been a mathematician. He or she had been a poet. As the first rays of Gallery Sigma's red dwarf sun brushed against the horizon, Nina leaned back in her chair. She was exhausted, but exhilarated. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Her fingers ached from tracing the sequence again and again. But in her chest, a strange certainty began to grow. The gate had waited 100 years to be heard in the right key, and the key, against all expectations, might just be a child's rhyme from a tiny blue planet far from the galactic core. Nina didn't speak of her discovery. Not yet. She carried it in her mind like a fragile ember, shielding it from the winds of doubt and distraction. The academy around her pulsed with relentless activity. Students cross-referencing galactic calculus with species-specific time mechanics. Professors reviewing antimatter ethics cases. Xenobotanists arguing over photosynthetic behavior in starscape flora. The hum of brilliance was deafening, but Nina moved through it with deliberate quiet, her eyes always alert, her ears attuned not to noise, but to rhythm. Her days became structured in two planes, the official and the secret. In lectures, she sat with her back straight, her notes precise, her answers sharp but never showy. Professor Jaronique occasionally paused when she asked a question, surprised by the clarity, though he seldom praised. Outside class, she drifted to hidden corners of the campus, under the levitating walkways, behind the gravity curve simulator, between the halls lined with symbiotic plant-light hybrids. There she whispered her rhyme, over and over, letting the cadence beat against the numbers in her head. She hadn't decoded the Sigma sequence yet, but something had shifted. The pattern now responded to her thoughts. It didn't give answers, it offered invitations. She imagined the sequence like a sentient thing, a coiled mechanism, waiting for the right mind to wind it open. She no longer looked at it as a problem to be conquered. It was a song waiting to be sung in the right key. On the fourth day after her realization, she went to the Central Archives. It was an enormous sphere suspended above the campus courtyard, accessible only through biometric permissions granted by academic merit. Her recent performance had unlocked entry. Inside, knowledge hovered like ghosts. Streaming lights of data, swarming archives of languages, sciences, rituals, and extinct mathematics. She didn't browse. She searched with purpose. Her fingers typed commands in rapid succession: recursive harmonic logic, pre-sequenced numerical rhythm, sequence-to-verse conversion. Most results yielded nothing relevant. Alien minds didn't think in rhyme. Their systems were hierarchical, not cyclical. Their logic linear, not lyrical. And yet, buried deep within the database, she found a single reference to an extinct Grolian dialect that used chanted mathematics to teach children spatial logic. She requested the file. It was only 27 seconds of audio and an incomplete transcription, but as she played it, her spine tingled. The chant followed a loop: building, folding, resetting. It wasn't her childhood rhyme, but the structure was similar. The aliens had lost the context of the chant, calling it primitive nonsense. Nina saw a cipher. She listened to it again and again, tapping her pencil to the beat, adjusting the numbers from the outer edge of the sequence in her notebook. The pattern shifted, revealing a subsequence she hadn't noticed before. An echo buried beneath the digits. She stayed in the archives for 6 hours without realizing it. That evening, while returning to her dorm, a voice called out behind her. "Human." She turned to see a tall Ilenthian student. His translucent skin flickered with cold blue tones, and his double-pupilled eyes stared down at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He approached slowly. "I've noticed you staring at the gate projection more than usual," he said. "Are you planning to solve it using your Earth fables?" Nina held his gaze. She didn't reply. He smiled without warmth. "You're entertaining. But don't forget, the last time a species attempted to brute force the sequence with analog logic, they went extinct. Math doesn't sing, human. It calculates." She walked past him without a word. Back in her dorm, she closed the door and shut the lights. The only illumination came from the projection of the sequence on her wall. She adjusted the frequency to isolate the newly discovered subsequence. It pulsed now, gently but steadily, like a heartbeat. She whispered the rhyme again, but this time in reverse. The pulse responded, slowing down. She flipped the sequence vertically and hummed a broken version of the chant from the Grolian archive. Again, the pulse reacted. She wasn't imagining this. The sequence was a layered code. It didn't just display numbers. It shifted based on the user's input rhythm. A species relying solely on visual analysis would never notice. But humans who grew up on lullabies, rituals, recursive songs, could hear what others could not. Sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, eyes open, as digits danced across the ceiling. She imagined the founders, whoever they were, encoded this not as a wall, but as a mirror. The real test wasn't knowledge, it was perception. Could someone recognize beauty in logic? Could a mind decode emotion within math? The next day, her logic synthesis class dragged endlessly. She kept glancing at the time, her mind itching to return to the sequence. When Professor Catal finally dismissed them, she bolted from the hall. Instead of returning to her dorm, she went to the empty observatory dome. It was rarely used except during celestial convergence studies. Tonight, it was silent. She activated the dome's interface and projected the full sigma sequence across the curved ceiling. Numbers filled the sky above her, rotating in solemn grace. She sat cross-legged in the center and began reciting. One verse, pause, second verse, faster, reversed, augmented. She beat her hands gently against the metal floor, drumming the pattern. As she did, the numbers began to swirl, not just visibly, but with audio resonance. The dome picked up a low-frequency vibration. She altered the rhythm again. The numbers trembled and reorganized, and then a flash. The center of the sequence expanded, revealing a core pattern. She froze. It was only visible for 3 seconds before retracting. She tried again, repeating the exact sequence of recitations, but nothing happened. 3 seconds was all she had, but it was enough to confirm it. There was a core, and it responded only to rhythmic activation. She sat in silence afterward, heart pounding. If she told anyone, they'd demand replication, and she couldn't yet. It wasn't luck, it was alignment, timing, frequency, intention. She needed to understand more. She needed to master this language of movement and math, and for that, she would need help. Someone who didn't dismiss rhythm as irrational, but whom could she trust in a place where most saw her as an anomaly? She left the dome just before curfew. The image of the hidden core burned into her mind. She didn't notice the quiet sensor above the entrance blinking red. Someone had been watching. The red light on the observatory sensor continued to blink long after Nina had left. Hidden in a faculty subchannel, a silent alert was logged and routed to the Office of Intellectual Integrity. Ordinarily, such alerts were only reviewed during monthly audits unless classified as high priority. This one flagged itself. The system's embedded learning model had detected pattern resonance within the sigma sequence, an event statistically close to zero probability. When the signature matched a human cadence model, the alert was auto-escalated. By the time Nina returned to her dorm, a copy of the incident had already been routed to Geranix. But Nina knew none of this. She couldn't sleep. Her body demanded rest, but her mind flickered restlessly with loops and pulses, replaying the sequence's core flash in every permutation she could remember. She scribbled fragments of numerical groupings into the edge of her pillowcase, onto the underside of her notebook, and across the illuminated wall screen that glowed faintly over her bed. The numbers were no longer just data. They were voices, speaking in dialects she was still learning to hear. The next morning, a message blinked on her console before sunrise. You are summoned to Professor Geranix's private observatory at first phase light. No explanation, no subject line, just coordinates. She dressed in silence, tying her hair back tightly, and left before the hallway lights fully powered up. Geranix's observatory was unlike the common campus domes. It wasn't open-sec and didn't float among the standard towers. It was suspended on its own platform, shielded, silent, and barely mentioned even among senior faculty. As she approached, the magnetic lift hummed low, ascending through layers of clear reinforced alloy. She passed no students, no guards, only invisible scanners and a singular glowing ring that admitted her through the main entrance. Inside, the temperature dropped by several degrees. The chamber was wide and dim, its walls layered in black lattice woven with shifting threads of violet light. At the far end, Geranix stood with his back turned, gazing at a levitating globe surrounded by rotating equations. His cloak shimmered faintly with motion-responsible ink. He didn't turn when she entered. You found the core, he said without greeting. Nina stopped several feet behind him, unsure whether to confirm or stay silent. I am not angry, he added, sensing her hesitation. Curious. The sensor logs matched only one known rhythm pattern in your species database, a primitive counting verse. She didn't respond. He finally turned, his eyes, deep and layered like polished obsidian, fixed on her with unnerving calm. Sit, she obeyed. Geran gestured, and a new projection unfolded. It was the sigma sequence, but now displayed with radiant threads branching out from each numeric node. Paths of potential resonance. The entire structure pulsed with slow, rhythmic waves, like breathing. He watched her study it. You are not the first to search for rhythm within the sequence, he said, but you are the first to make it respond. Nina kept her hands in her lap. Because I didn't analyze it, I listened. Explain. She took a breath. Everyone approaches it with logic first. Fractal math, dimensional compression, syntactical reduction. But those methods assume the sequence was written to be solved by linear computation. I think it wasn't. I think it was meant to test perception across cognitive styles. Rhythm is perception in time. Pattern recognition through experience, not only deduction. Geranix regarded her for a long moment, the corners of his face unreadable. And your rhyme? How did it begin? Nina hesitated, but then recited it softly, her voice steady despite the oddness of chanting a children's song inside the galaxy's most prestigious observatory. Geranix said nothing when she finished. Fascinating, he murmured. The verse is recursive, yet emotionally guided, not cold logic. Human logic. Messy. Non-deterministic, but structurally coherent beneath the disorder. He rotated the projection again. The sequence is more than a code. It is an invitation to collaborate. Most assumed it was a monologue. You interpreted it as a duet. Nina looked up. Have you tried answering it? Jeronic's expression twitched. Just a fraction. I attempted rhythm-based activation decades ago. I lacked the framework. Cephalarians process data in multi-learner stacks, not recursive emotional loops. What you've uncovered suggests the authors of the sequence included a communicative component tailored to minds that perceive through emotion pattern structures, which is not our way. He moved to a console, entering a string of pulses that caused the projection to stabilize. I will grant you limited access to the core model, he said. You are to study it under containment only. No data export, no replication. The sequence is woven into the substrate of the Academy's protective grid. Misalignment could have systemic consequences. Nina nodded. One more thing, he added. You will not speak of this to your classmates. Curiosity is volatile among immature intellects, and I suspect not all who watch you do so with interest alone. She didn't need clarification. She had felt the eyes. The quiet tension in the corridors, the glance too long from the Iolinthian student 2 days prior. Understood. He turned away. Then go. And don't be late for your gravitational ethics class again. Professor Cathal has no patience for temporal imprecision. As she exited the observatory, her heart pounded with a mix of fear and adrenaline. She had been given permission, but also a warning. The sequence was more than a puzzle. It was a gate in every sense, and she was no longer approaching it as a student, but as someone standing at the threshold. Back in her dorm that evening, she accessed the restricted archive link provided by Gerenix. The core data loaded with a slow bloom of blue light, forming a toroidal structure, rotating on a vertical axis. It emitted sound, barely perceptible, like the hum of distant wind. She dimmed the lights, closed her eyes, and listened. For hours, she mapped the pulses, aligned them with syllables, repeated the process with variations. Sometimes the model reacted, sometimes it did not. When it did, small substructures appeared, glimmering with latent data. She couldn't translate them yet, but she sensed meaning, like glimpsing a face behind a waterfall. At one point, when her voice cracked from overuse, she switched to silent rhythm, tapping her fingers in verse matters on the console's surface. The structure responded faintly, validating her hypothesis. The sequence recognized rhythm independent of language. At midnight, she paused to eat a protein gel. While unwrapping the pack, she heard a soft tone at her door. Not the doorbell, a manual knock. She froze. No one used manual knocks. She approached cautiously. Who is it? No reply. She activated the outer lens. The hallway was empty, but a small object sat on the floor. She opened the door slowly and picked it up. A folded piece of ancient paper, handmade. She unfolded it carefully. One sentence was written inside, in rough Terran ink. The gate has more than one key. Her pulse spiked. She scanned the paper for residue, fingerprints. Nothing. Whoever left it knew how to avoid sensor detection. She didn't sleep. The next day, in xenolinguistics, she found a message etched lightly into the corner of her desk. North Garden, midnight. She burned the message after class. If she was being watched, she had to be cautious, but she also couldn't ignore the invitation. Someone else knew about the core. Or worse, someone wanted her to stop. But stopping wasn't an option now. She had touched something ancient, something waiting. The sequence had opened a door, and something behind it was listening. The North Garden at midnight was not the peaceful retreat it appeared during daylight hours. In the dark, it whispered. The genetically engineered leaves swayed without wind, whispering against one another with the sound of language that had never been spoken aloud. Bioluminescent vines coiled around floating stone paths, pulsing faintly in colors that shifted in response to emotional energy. Above, the glass dome refracted distant starlight in broken lines, as though the heavens themselves were fractured. Nina moved silently, her boots brushing the dew-laced moss that grew between polished stone panels. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. Even her console remained silent. No tracking signals, no biometric feedback. She had rerouted the data lines before leaving, creating a phantom version of her digital presence in the central dorm network. It was a risky maneuver, technically a breach of protocol, but whatever she was walking into, she had to do it without watchers. She passed the reflecting pool and stopped near the weeping skylilac tree, the one whose leaves shimmered like liquid silver when touched by thought. There, on the far side, a shadow moved. At first, she saw only the silhouette, a slender figure draped in something dark, not part of any academy uniform. The shadow didn't step into the light. Instead, a voice spoke, calm, precise, and filtered through a soft distortion modulator. "You opened a path." Nina didn't reply. She waited. "You are not the first to reach the core," the voice continued. "But you are the first," it answered. She narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" The figure shifted slightly, but didn't approach. "Call me Merrick. I am unaffiliated now. Once, I worked in sequence retrieval. Long before your arrival," she stepped closer. "You left a message at my door." "Yes. And I watched your second activation from the observatory records. What you are doing is dangerous, but not because of the sequence. Because of those who watch it." Nina folded her arms. "You mean the administration?" Merrick let out a short, bitter laugh. "The administration is curious. Others are invested. There are factions within the council who believe the sequence must remain unsolved, that its activation would destabilize power balances far beyond this academy." Nina's heart skipped. "Why?" He finally stepped forward. His face was partially covered, but his eyes were visible, piercing, ringed with faint neural tattoos that marked him as former cognitive division. "Because the sequence," he said slowly, "is not a lock. It is a signal, a message buried across space-time. When fully decoded, it will not give us energy. It will give us contact." She stiffened. "With whom?" He shook his head. "No one knows. That's the point. Some believe it was left by a pre-galactic intelligence that seeded early civilizations. Others think it's a warning, a map of what not to do." Nina lowered her voice. "Why tell me this now?" "Because you're close," he said. "And because the last person who reached the third stage of the core vanished. Her work was erased, her name wiped. If you go forward, you need to understand what's at stake." She hesitated, a war waging silently in her chest. But then she lifted her chin. "I'm not stopping." Merrick stared at her, unmoving. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small crystalline shard, no larger than her palm. He handed it over. "This is an access prism," he said. "It decodes a layer of the sequence not visible through standard interfaces. I smuggled it out years ago. It's keyed to your biological frequency now. Use it only once. After that, it becomes inert." She took it carefully, its surface humming faintly as it registered her touch. "What will I see?" "Not what," he said. "Who?" And then he vanished into the shadows, leaving only the residual echo of his voice bouncing through the leaves. Back in her room, Nina locked the door and sealed the windows. The prism pulsed steadily now, synced to her heartbeat. She placed it into the auxiliary port of her console, overriding its main projection lens. The interface flickered, blinked, then bled into a new shape. An unfamiliar architecture formed of concentric thought maps and harmonic phase lines. It was more organic than digital, a fractal intelligence rendered as light and sound. She activated her previous work, the part of the sequence she had partially unlocked, and let the prism filter its deeper layer. As the code unfolded, she saw something emerge from within the center. Not numbers this time, but symbols. Symbols from multiple languages. Terran, Dralian, Old Grolian, even pictographs from extinct systems. The sequence wasn't just a code, it was a chorus of cultures. An effort of minds that spanned millennia and star systems, each adding a layer, a syllable, a heartbeat. At the heart of it, one glyph repeated itself across every band, a spiral folding inward with a single line breaking from its edge. It felt familiar, but she couldn't place why. She blinked twice, and the interface responded, zooming in on the spiral's variations across each system. Every version had the same flaw, an imperfection at the break. as if the creators had intentionally corrupted the final loop. She stared at it for a long time, and something old surfaced in her mind. A story her grandmother used to tell, about a spider building a perfect web that collapsed whenever it reached the last thread, because the final line had to remain flawed, or the web would trap its own creator. Her fingers moved quickly now, aligning the spiral's trajectory with her old rhyme's cadence. She didn't recite it aloud this time, only tapped it silently against the console. The sequence shifted again, but instead of opening, it rotated laterally, revealing an interface she hadn't seen before. It was a message, compressed, encoded in musical notation, and translated loosely into human script. When language fails, rhythm will carry memory across extinction. Her breath caught. The sequence was not just a puzzle or a signal. It was a lifeline, a preservation vault for intelligence too fragile to survive in one form. And now, through rhythm, through a child's rhyme, she had tapped into its melody. Suddenly, a power fluctuation swept through the interface. The console dimmed, the lights blinked out. A cold pulse passed through her body like static. And then, a new presence emerged. Not a voice, not a face, just awareness. She couldn't define it, but she knew she wasn't alone. The prism glowed violently for a moment, and the words reappeared, this time pulsing in time with her heart. Remember the break. You must not seal it. Then the sequence vanished from the interface, and the system rebooted. She stared at the now blank screen, her mouth dry. The spiral, the imperfection, the warning. What had she awakened, and why did it fear being made whole? Nina didn't sleep for 2 cycles. Not because she feared what would happen if she closed her eyes, but because every time she tried, the message reappeared. Not on her screen, but in her mind. Remember the break. You must not seal it. It echoed behind her thoughts like the aftershock of sound in a deep canyon. She didn't tell anyone. Not Jurenix, not Merrick. She needed time to understand what had changed and what part of the sequence had now become tethered to her. In the sterile quiet of her dorm, she analyzed the spiral glyph again, now etched into her memory with the clarity of a scar. She drew it by hand on every surface she could find, digital paper, cloth, the margin of her blanket, each version with the same deliberate fracture. She studied its geometry, ran spectral harmonic analysis, cross-referenced it with extinction logs and pre-exit archives. Nothing came close. It wasn't part of any known symbolic language. It was not meant to communicate a concept. It was meant to preserve a failure. And then, it finally made sense. The Sigma sequence wasn't designed to be solved. It was designed to stop someone from solving it. The creators had embedded a failure into the code, not out of error, but intention. The spiral's break wasn't a flaw. It was a lock, not to protect what was inside, but to protect the galaxy from what could emerge if the loop ever completed. She needed to speak with Jurenix, but by the time she reached his observatory, the chamber was sealed. Emergency protocols blinked in silent red patterns across the walls. No entry permitted. She checked her console, no reply to her messages. And then, an encrypted file dropped into her archive. No signature. But she knew who it was from. She activated it in isolation. Merrick appeared in a pre-recorded message, his face lined with urgency. The Council knows. Someone reported your prism activation. Jurenix has been taken into containment, accused of compromising the sequence firewall. You need to leave campus now. I've rerouted your ID through an obsolete logistics tunnel beneath the archives. You have 2 hours. Her hands trembled as she packed. She didn't know what she would do or where she would go, but she couldn't stay. She had become the center of a threat no one understood, and those who feared understanding it would silence her before risking another layer of truth escaping the sequence's bounds. The tunnels beneath the archives were colder than she expected, the stone older than the academy itself. She moved quickly, the prism still clenched in her fist, its glow dimmer now, but still alive. She followed Merrick's coordinates to the emergency access hatch, buried behind the decommissioned planetary cartography wing. It took all her strength to pry it open. Beyond it, A maintenance corridor sloped into darkness. She stopped at the threshold. If she stepped through, she would no longer be a student. She would be a fugitive. Every accomplishment, every recognition, every future posting in the galactic core, gone. But if she stayed, she would be used. Or destroyed. Or worse, forced to finish the sequence under the oversight of a council that wanted to silence the voice embedded within it. She stepped through. The hatch sealed behind her. 3 standard days passed. No transmissions. No signals. Then, on the 4th day, a message appeared on a private relay channel, an ancient frequency used during the collapse wars. She opened it. Juranic's voice was weak. "You were right. The break in the sequence is intentional. It marks a failsafe. I accessed the original design archives. Buried beneath layers of decoy data, the founders encoded a limit into the final recursion. If someone completes the pattern, it triggers a protocol not of our time, but of the creators themselves." Nina leaned forward. "What kind of protocol?" His voice faltered. The word was a whisper that wrapped around her ribs and held her lungs still. "The sequence is a song for civilizations. But it's also a measurement, a clock. It tracks developmental thresholds across cultures that discover it. Completion is not rewarded. It is punished. If we finish the sequence, it assumes we have become a threat." The recording ended without farewell. She sat motionless for hours. The temptation had always been to solve it, to prove intellect, to unlock hidden power, gain recognition, shape the future. But now she understood. The final spiral didn't lead to enlightenment. It led to annihilation. She took the prism and walked to the edge of the cave system, where she had hidden since leaving the academy. The sky above was empty, the stars faint through the planetary dust. She dug a shallow hole and placed the prism inside, covering it with stones. Then she activated her console one last time and composed a message. Short, direct, final. To those who seek to complete the Sigma sequence, stop. It is not a gift, it is a warning. Let the loop remain broken. Let the song remain unfinished. She uploaded it to every independent science relay on the fringe of the galactic network. Untraceable. Irrevocable. And then she shut down the console. Months passed. She found a place among the orbital nomads who mapped gas anomalies and stellar echoes in unclaimed systems. She never revealed her name. She fixed damaged equipment, traded math for meals, listened more than she spoke. Her hands remained steady. Her mind never stopped hearing the rhythm. But she never touched the sequence again. In time, the story began to spread. Not of Nina, but of the human who solved the unsolvable and refused to complete it. A human who heard a whisper inside the code and chose to listen rather than command. To some, she became myth. To others, proof that restraint was the truest form of intelligence. The gate at Gallery Sigma still stood, numbers rotating in eternal invitation. Students passed beneath it, marveling at its mystery, trying their hand at its first layer, but none could reach the core again. The prism was gone, the rhythm silent, the signal buried. And far away, under a sky of foreign stars, a woman with quiet eyes tapped her fingers gently against a rusted table, humming a tune that had once held the key to the end of worlds. She smiled and let the last note go unanswered.